Hello, BookTube. How's it going? Welcome back to Reading in the Dark. Byron here. This video is one that I've been kind of excited to do for quite a while, and this is my review of the novella McGlue, that rhymed, by Ottessa Moshfegh. Now, this is not a new book. This is a book that was actually published in various forms as early as 2014. It's being republished by Penguin Books on January 8th. You actually can't get a Kindle edition of this book because the book is being re-released on January 8th, and the Kindle edition of the old version is no longer available. So I got a copy of this on paperback. I received it the first day of Booktubeathon, actually, put it on my shelf and looked forward to the day that I would get to actually read it, but I did get a copy and I read it, and I'm going to talk to you about it today. Ottessa Moshfegh, of course, is the author of Eileen, My Year of Rest and Relaxation, and the short story collection Homesick for Another World. Oh my god, I keep forgetting the name of that collection. Now, I have not read the short story collection, but I have read Eileen, and my video review of My Year of Rest and Relaxation is up on my channel as well, and I'll link it in the description below. But so McGlue is, this copy that I read was 118 pages long. It's definitely a novella. It's short, but it's not like the shortest thing in the world. This is a really interesting book. This was the first book that Moshfegh had published. The book was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize in 2016, and it was the inaugural winner of the Fence Modern Prize for Prose and the Believer Book Award. It's being republished on January 8th, and I wanted to finally read my copy before the new version with this cover is released in the US and probably all over. There's also going to be, amazingly, an audiobook of this released in conjunction with the new paperback and Kindle editions of McGlue on January 8th, and it's going to be narrated by Chris Shula, who I found on YouTube just to kind of get an idea of what his voice sounded like, and it's an interesting choice, and I think it could be a pretty amazing audiobook. This is a really interesting story. So there's a review from Kirkus Reviews that I think kind of sums up some of the ways I feel about Moshfegh pretty well, and they say, Moshfegh's fiction often fetishizes the repellent, vomit, blood, or capacity for callously using each other, but in time, McGlue's tale acquires tenderness of a sort. That's partly thanks to Moshfegh's lyricism, a potent, peculiar, and hallucinatory anti-romance. This book made me feel similarly to the way Eileen made me feel. It is kind of dark and gritty, and there are elements of it that are repellent, but her writing is just so idiosyncratic and so funny. She's just so adroitly describes moments of confusion better than like almost any other author. Like, I can read a nonsensical paragraph written by Ottessa Moshfegh and I understand what's happening, what is meant by what is being said, and I know that they're either drunk or they're on drugs or they're half asleep or they're having a dream, but somehow it hangs together and makes sense. I was really transported by this book as well because it's historical fiction. It's a sailor, and it's like the 1850s, I believe, and his name, he only goes by McGlue, and it basically tells a story of his relationship with a man named only Johnson. Basically, McGlue was a troubled child. He's like the middle child. He had an older brother who was killed in a construction accident, and he has a younger sister. But he left home, he was always getting into trouble, and he basically, at a very young age, he became an alcoholic. All he's ever really wanted to do is escape and get out of his own head and not have to think about life and the world generally through alcohol, although I think that he's probably not above using drugs. So he leaves home and he becomes an alcoholic at a very young age. And then later on in the book, he's basically discovered freezing, sitting on the ground at the base of a tree by this man who is only known as Johnson throughout the book, who convinces him to get on the horse with him and go with him. He gets him cleaned up, and he has a lot of money, this guy, and he basically gets him shaved and cleaned up and dressed properly, and he checks him into a boarding home. And then he comes back after a while because he starts seeing articles in the paper about all of the trouble McGlue is getting into, and they end up on a ship as sailors together. And then at some point during their journey, while they're sailors on this ship, they stop in port somewhere, and I don't remember where because there's lots of different locations. At some point in one of these ports, they get into some trouble in a town, and something happens. And in his extreme drunkenness, McGlue doesn't remember any of it. The way the book reads, though, is not really chronological. The book starts with McGlue waking up in the hold below decks on the ship, being told that Johnson is dead and he killed him. Now, he doesn't remember doing it. He thinks that's ridiculous, and it takes him a very long time to process the information that Johnson is supposedly dead and he killed him. And the story of McGlue's relationship to Johnson, is told basically through flashbacks as McGlue reaches in through the fogginess of his like alcohol-addled memory to try and figure out what happened. And as he's remembering, we're learning details of their relationship, and we're learning what happened as well. Something that happens throughout this book are these like somewhat subtle and kind of veiled references to them having a sexual relationship. This was a time when you could fall in love with another man and be in a relationship, but in order to survive in the world, you needed to keep it secret. And the best way to do that is to sort of not even acknowledge it yourself. You have to imagine that during this time, there were obviously still gay people, and there were a lot of men and women who were engaged in same-sex relationships, and all of them were on the down low, like big time. You wouldn't just be shunned by society, but you'd probably be considered mentally ill, and you could end up in an asylum if you were gay, and you could certainly end up dead. There are moments when you know exactly what she's saying, and you know what she's talking about, and you know what she's alluding to, but she sort of skirts the explicit stating of their relationship and the nature of it in the same way that the two of them do. And it's really brilliant because it puts you in the same headspace that these two men are in. My experience of reading this book was a really good one. I found it really, really fascinating. I read this book in one night while I had like this like crashing ocean waves, stormy night on the high seas, like ASMR video playing on YouTube in my bedroom. And it kind of set the mood. I love historical fiction. And this book kind of was sort of like a sweet spot for me because I really enjoy Ottessa Moshfegh. I love her sense of humor. This book was filled with her sort of trademark sardonic sense of humor. But it's also amazing to have an Ottessa Moshfegh book that's also historical fiction because it's set so long ago and it's set in a very exotic land for me, you know, because these are sailors and they're all over the world. So having all of those elements combined into one story all at once, all under the very steady hand of Moshfegh's beautiful writing was pretty awesome. I highlighted all kinds of passages in the book while I was reading it, and it took me like, I don't know, maybe 4 hours to read this book, which is a little bit, honestly, maybe even a little bit slow. But again, I was highlighting a lot. And I just really enjoyed this. This book deals with themes of mental illness and self-loathing and repression and homophobia, depression, addiction, alcoholism, and sort of like the unhappy intersection of society repressing people and trying to live your own inner truth. What's really amazing about this is that it's a story about a man who's been lying to himself. And it's also the story about a man who has been so ill from drinking that he really literally can't remember what happened. And so in some ways, he doesn't know himself any better than we do. So while we read his process of sobering up and slowly trying to piece together the threads of his memory to figure out what happened and remind himself or maybe learn or confront for the first time who he really is, we get to come along for the ride and learn who he is as well. That is just a really great device. I thought it worked really beautifully. I gave this book 4 stars, and the reason I didn't give it 5, there's always a reason with Ottessa Moshfegh. So I gave it 4 stars. It's beautifully written, okay? It is engaging, it's never slow, I was never bored. Obviously, it's not long. It's a historical fiction, which I love, and the setting and everything and some of the vernacular and everything was all really fascinating. And it deals with LGBT themes really intelligently and really, really well in a very sensitive way. And the characters were really well drawn. And there aren't that many complicated, masculine, conflicted, gay male characters in the world, and I'm just so grateful that this story exists. I think this might make a great movie one day, but it falls short of 5 stars for me because I never made that final trip across the divide to where I was really, truly emotionally invested in this character. It was sad, and it was bleak, and it was gritty, and it was actually kind of funny because, again, Moshfegh, in an intellectual way, looking at the story, looking at the big picture, I loved the idea of this story. I loved the idea of this character. I was fascinated by the concept. And it's really, really beautifully written, and there's some wonderful prose in here. Everybody can learn how to write a beautiful sentence by reading great writers like Ottessa Moshfegh. But I, personally, this is a book that I think I should have been more emotionally invested in, and it fell short of that for me. I didn't shed a tear. Like, I didn't cry when I read this book. McGlue, the character, sort of spends his whole life trying to hide from his inner truth and trying to kind of keep people at arm's length. And if they get too close, then he'll just be a jerk to them. And as a result, he succeeds, but it also succeeds in keeping the reader at arm's length too. I felt like there was just a last added something that wasn't quite connecting. So I really enjoyed this book, and I will probably read it again. Obviously, it doesn't take much time to read, and I always enjoy reading Moshfegh, but it wasn't perfect. And, you know, not every book can be. After this, I'm looking forward to reading her short story collection, Homesick for Another World. Yeah. And then I'll be sad because then there will be nothing left to read. I'm sure she's writing something else. I would just love for Ottessa Moshfegh to write more historical fiction because it's like my bag. I just love it. And I think the reason I love it so much is because historical fiction takes you to another world in the same way that fantasy and sci-fi can take you to another world. This was a wonderful book. I really enjoyed it, and I highly recommend it. I gave it 4 stars out of 5, and it will be released anew on January 8th on Kindle, paperback, and audiobook by Penguin Books. And that's my review for McGlue, and that rhymed again. If you enjoyed this review, please hit that like button, and if you'd like to see more content like this, make sure to subscribe to Reading in the Dark, and you can hit that little bell icon so that you'll be notified every time a new video is posted. I appreciate you taking the time to be here with me today to talk about this wonderful book, and until next time, I will be here in the dark, reading. Bye, guys.